Okay, good morning, Florida Clubman Association. This is Tommy Spaulding, and so good to be with you this morning. I'm in beautiful Lost Tree Club in Florida with my good friend Rick Bayless, who's hosting me today. I have the honor to be speaking to his team this afternoon and doing a team building with his leadership team tonight. And so it's great to do my first webinar from a real club in Lost Tree. We've been doing these webinars, these heart-led webinars for over almost 3 years now since COVID. And I wanted to reach out to my good friend, Beth Sargent with the Florida Club Managers Association, just partnering with me on this idea that we had, bringing amazing speakers and leaders to you. And I think over the last 3 years, we've had over 30 different thought leaders, from speakers to authors to CEOs to real live heart-led leaders that have come on these webinar series. And we are closing this chapter of the series today with my new book that's coming out in 13 days called The Gift of Influence. And this is actually one of the first ones that are printed. I got 12 copies yesterday from my publisher. And in 13 days, this book is going live and going to be reaching millions of people around the world. And this is my second time actually delivering this new keynote on the gift of influence. So really honored to be delivering that. Beth's going to move to the next slide. I heard a story, 3 or 4, 5 years ago that just moved me, that absolutely changed my life. And I want to share the story because this is the story that really got me thinking about the power of influence, and really motivated me to write a book on the gift of influence. And it's actually a true story. And it's about this math teacher from a little town outside of Lincoln, Nebraska in the early 1960s. And this math teacher's name was Mrs. Lynn. And Mrs. Lynn taught 8th grade algebra. And this is an amazing true story that warmed me in a way that I hope it warms you. And one day, Mrs. Lynn's teaching algebra to 8th grade students on a Friday afternoon. And it wasn't just any Friday afternoon, but it was the last period of the day. And it wasn't just the last period of the day on a Friday afternoon that Mrs. Lynn was teaching this class, but it was actually a Friday afternoon, the last period of the day, in the last period before spring break began in March. And then 36 students come walking in her classroom. The windows are open, the sun's shining out, and these kids are just bouncing off the walls because they're 50 minutes away from spring break. And Mrs. Lynn was a seasoned teacher, and she knew right away that she needed to call an audible because she wasn't teaching algebra that day with these kids bouncing off the walls 50 minutes away from spring break, last period of the day. And so she says to her students, everyone, we're not doing algebra today, but everyone take out a piece of paper. And she asked all the students to copy everything she writes on the chalkboard. And so she grabs a piece of chalk and she writes everyone's first and last name of all the students in her class. And she asked all the students to write all the students' names, all 36 students, on their piece of paper. And what she said was, I want you to spend the class writing one kind word about each and every one of your students. And so the students listened, and they took out a piece of paper and a pencil, and they wrote down all 36 names of all their students. And they spent the whole period, the last period before spring break, writing one kind word about each and every one of her students. At the end of the class, the bell rang. She collected the 36 pieces of paper. They went off to spring break. And here's what Mrs. Lynn did during her spring break. She got out 36 blank pieces of paper and wrote the first name on each and every one of those pieces of paper of each one of her students. And then she transcribed all 36 words. And so if my friend Rick Bayless is in that class, it would say Rick in 36 beautiful words about him. My friend Sherry that's here at Lost Tree, her name Sherry would be at the top of the list, and then all 36 words about Sherry. And she did this all 36 students. This took all spring break. And she was so excited about giving this piece of paper back to her students the following week. Well, spring break was over. The following Monday, these 36 students walk in her classroom first thing in the morning, and she hands out and hands back these 36 pieces of paper to her 36 club students. And for 10 minutes, Mrs. Lynn got to watch 8th grade students and those that have kids that are in the 8th grade. I had one that just graduated 8th grade. Such a formidable year of finding out who you are and just, figuring out your identity and just figuring out, life. And, self-confidence in that whole thing. And so Mrs. Lynn got to marvel over watching 36 of her students just read 36 words about what makes them beautiful. And Mrs. Lynn saw some kids blush. She even saw kids fighting back some tears and some chuckles and some smiles. And it was the most beautiful exercise. Anyway, 10 minutes are up. He tells the students to take out her math book and she starts teaching math. And she never talked about that exercise ever again. Fast forward 6 years later, now we're in the mid to late 1960s. And Mrs. Lynn gets a phone call from the principal down the street. And a phone call that no teacher, no parent ever wants to get. And the phone call was about one of her former students, Mark, who was in her 8th grade class years ago, graduated high school. She was the quarterback of the football team, got drafted to fight in the Vietnam War. Now we're in the late 1960s, and he was killed in the Battle of Da Nang in Vietnam. And his body was flown back, and they're having a huge memorial for the first fallen soldier from Vietnam in this small town in Nebraska. And the principal was inviting all of Mark's former teacher to attend the funeral. And so Mrs. Lynn goes to the funeral, and it was just packed with people celebrating Mark's life. It was the most beautiful service of a fallen soldier, former quarterback of the football team, former star of that town, now killed. And as she was walking out of the church to go home, she ran into some other teachers saying they were all going to Mark's home to celebrate his life with his family. So Mrs. Lynn decides to go, and she's in the kitchen. It's eating sponge cake, watching all these amazing people talk about Mark's life. And all of a sudden, Mark's father walks up to Mrs. Lynn and says to her, "There's something that I want to give you. You mind following me?" Mark's father leads Mrs. Lynn through a hallway. And the last room on the left in this dark hallway was a bedroom. And then he opened the door, and within moments, Mrs. Lynn is standing in Mark's childhood bedroom. And she knew it was Mark's childhood bedroom because there was a Cornhusker duvet on the bed. There was football trophies everywhere and posters of sports. And she just got goosebumps. But then she looks to the corner of the bed and she sees something that just strikes her and gives her even more goosebumps. And it was a camouflage infantry helmet. And Mark's father notices her looking at this. And so Mark's father walks over and grabs the infantry helmet and hands it to her and says, "This is what I wanted to show you." And she didn't understand. She's Mark's 8th grade algebra teacher. Like, why is his father inviting me into his room? And why is he giving me this infantry helmet? And Mark's father says, "Turn it upside down." And so she turns the infantry helmet upside down, and stuck in one of those rubber bands, elastic bands that holds that helmet tight, was a 6-year-old yellow stained, scotch taped piece of paper. And she takes the piece of paper out of the band and she opens it up. And it was her handwriting with the name Mark at the top of the page and 36 beautiful words about him. And she started to cry because she knew exactly what that piece of paper was. And then Mark's father says to Mrs. Lynn, "My son loved this piece of paper. He read it many, many times, and he carried it with him always. And when my son was killed last week in Vietnam, and they found his body, they found this piece of paper stuck under his helmet. And it was with him in his last moments. You had a huge influence on my son's life." When I first heard that story, it moved me like it's moving me now. And when I first heard that true story years ago, I realized, and I knew then, that I wanted to have that kind of influence on the lives of others. I wanted to make a difference in the world, and I wanted to change lives like Mrs. Lynn did. And when I realized that stories, anyone can change people's lives, not just algebra teachers, but whatever you do. And it really inspired me to this new concept of the gift of influence. Beth, if you can move to the next slide. Years ago, I was at a leadership session called the National Leadership Academy Book and Benefit. We brought in a good friend of mine, John Gordon, who was speaking about influence. And from the just off the top of his head, those that read John Gordon books, he's just genius. He just said off the top of his head that he was on the radio one day listening, and there was a DJ that was talking about influence. And then he heard that Stanford University did this research that the average human being influences 80,000 people in their lives. And then he went on to something else. And John just kind of mentioned that in his talk. And as soon as I heard that, the average human being on this planet influences 80,000 people, that just kind of just hit me. And it just stuck in my heart. You ever hear anything in your life that just moves you and sticks with you? For weeks, for months, I thought about that number, 80,000 people, that we have an opportunity to change 80,000 lives. So I dug into the research, and here's what Stanford came up with. The average human being in the world lives to 78 years old. And if you take 78 years old and you divide it by 365 days a year, you get 2.8 people a day. So this research states that every day we meet 2.8 new people a day. Let's just call it 3 people a day, times 365 days, times 78 years. That's 80,000 people. So in our lifetimes, we have a chance to meet 3 new people. Just today, I walked out of my Marriott hotel that Rick was so kind to host me in, had breakfast, got to know my waiter, talked to him, drove over here, person at the Lost Tree Club that let me in. She was cleaning the lobby area, got to talk to her. She brought me up to the 3rd floor and met one of Rick's employees. Like that was just 3 people and it's 10 o'clock. I'll meet 10 people today. But the average human being meets 3 people: the post office person, the barista at Starbucks, the Uber driver, the flight attendant, the new employee, the new client. We meet 2.8 people a day our whole lives. So this got me thinking. It's got me really thinking. Well, what if at the end of our lives, we got to meet these people? Like, what if at the end of our lives, we got to meet all 80,000 people, all the 2.8 people that we meet for 365 days, for 78 years? At the end of our life, what if we got to say goodbye to all 80,000 people? I got thinking about that for months. I became obsessed with thinking about what that would feel like. And where would they fit? Well, they would fit in football stadiums. And here's the picture of one right here. So I did some research. There's actually 37 stadiums in the country that have exactly 80,000 seats. Lambeau Field, University of Notre Dame, University of South Carolina, even internationally, Beijing Olympic Park, where the opening ceremonies were in Beijing just months ago, 80,000. Melbourne, Australia, their park there, 80,000. There are stadiums all over the world with 80,000 people. And so here's the question I'm asking you. At the end of your life, before you go to heaven or wherever your faith takes you, what if each and every one of us walks on the 50-yard line of our favorite stadium, and we walk there by ourselves right before we're about to die, and we're there in front of 80,000 people, every single person that we've met in our entire life? And the question is, what's the sound of that stadium? Everyone you've ever met in your life is there to say goodbye. Are they giving you a stand ovation because you have spent a life pouring into others? You have spent a life changing lives, making friends, having an influence on others. Or is the stadium booing and just screaming and yelling and saying terrible things because you weren't nice and you just looked away and you lived a life of just service to yourself and not to others? Or even worse, is the stadium silent because you spent your whole life on this phone looking down and not looking up? Let's look at all the people we can influence. And if you knew today, if you knew right now that you're going to meet all 80,000 people when you die one day, would you start to lead differently? Would you start to love differently? Would you start to pick your head up and treat people a little differently? I believe you would. So that's the kind of the secret sauce. I heard this Mrs. Lynn story that just moved me. And I started thinking about this research of 80,000. And the goal is that if we truly live a life of influence, and every morning we wake up and ask ourselves, not how could the world serve me, or who could help me? But we wake up every morning, who can I bless? Who can I serve? Who can I have an influence on? At the end of our lives, we're going to be in a stadium and we're going to have 80,000, if not more, fans just thanking us and screaming and yelling with such love because we made a difference in the lives of others. And I want to have this influence on people, and I know you do too. So we're going to talk about that. Beth, if you can move to the next slide. For me, it all started here. Many of you have seen this picture before. This is Tommy Spaulding, 35 pounds ago, 35 years ago. This is my senior class picture of Suffern High School. I struggled academically in school. I was dyslexic. I had a hard time getting through school. And this man to my right, Tom France, he changed my life. He had the greatest influence on me as a young man, because I was failing out of school. I was struggling academically. I was trying to figure out school in the resource room. All my kids were going to college and all these great schools, Michigan, Harvard, Notre Dame. And I was going to state schools and community colleges and trade schools. Right? But Tom France saw something. He was in an organization called Rotary. And there was this youth program for high school sophomores called Rotary Youth Leadership Academy. And some of you have heard this story before, where I went to this leadership camp when I was just 15 years old. And I met Tom France for the first time. And there were hundreds of high school kids, all in New York, at this leadership camp. And at the end of the camp, Tom France was our keynote speaker. And he spoke about leadership in the way that I never heard it. That leadership is about love. This is 35 years ago. Leadership was about influence. And that there's 3 types of people in the whole world. 3 types of people. You're either going to be a leader, a follower, or a critic. And then Tom asked all the high school students, which one are you going to be? It was the first time in my young adult life at 15 years old that I realized that leadership is a choice. Every morning we wake up, decide not to be a follower, not to be a critic, that we want to be leaders. And that was a huge influence in my life. And I think I'm, teaching and studying leadership as a full-time author and thought leader. 35 years later, I've dedicated my life to this subject of leadership, because it all began with one person teaching me that leadership is all about influence. Beth, the next slide, please. And so really, here's the secret sauce. Go back one, Beth, if you can. This is the secret sauce, the 2 circles right here. We always talk about leadership. I've written 2 books on leadership. I've spent my whole life studying and teaching the subject of leadership. And here's what I've learned after 5 years of writing this book. Influence is not a part of leadership. Influence is leadership. And when we get older one day and retire and we kind of look back at our lives, people aren't going to say, man, I love the way Rick Bayless managed me. I love the way he loved me. I love the way he parented me. I love the way he husbanded me. People don't say those things. They're going to say, Rick changed my life. Rick had a huge influence on my life. His employees, his wife, his 2 daughters, his son, right, Trey, people in his life, they're going to say, this man had a huge influence on our lives. So we focus so much on leadership, but at the end of the day, it's the influence that we have on the lives of others is our greatest legacy. And we're going to talk about the word influence. Beth, if you can move to the next slide. It's interesting, if you Google the word influence, which is like crazy, just Google it when you get off this webinar. The definition is total bullshit. It's all about social media. It's all about how many hits you have, how many likes you have. It's totally about social media marketing. The influencer is kind of like a bad word. The Kardashians are selling tequila with The Rock, or it's how many hits you have, how many likes you have. And so when we wrote the book, The Gift of Influence, the first thing we did is we're going to hijack that word back. Influence, being an influencer, is not about how much stuff you can sell on the internet. It's not about how many likes or how many friends you have on social media. To be a true influencer is to change the lives of others through service to others. And so when I wrote the book, I decided to write down a list of all these amazing influencers that had lifelong impact on the lives of others, and also had unprecedented results in their organizations because they led in a very special way. They were more than heart-led leaders. right? They were more with been building fifth floor relationships, two things I've been talking about for 15, 20 years of my career. But they had this influential nature of their heart. And they went to work every day, truly trying to influence other people's lives. And I want to tell you some of their stories this morning. Beth, we can move to the next slide. This is an amazing true story of a man that I met a couple of years ago named George Taylor. And George Taylor is in my book, and he has an incredible story. He's from Wilmington, North Carolina. He's a software geek. This guy's a total software nerd, and he made some money in the software industry, and he sold his company, and he's kind of a little entrepreneur, got into the brewing business and had this little brewing company that he sold, and he had this passion, for his community. And one day he's kind of barbecuing in the backyard in his little beautiful house, gated community in Wilmington, North Carolina, and he hears on the news that a 16-year-old boy was shot and killed just miles away near his downtown office. And he was shocked to hear that was gang related. He didn't even know there was gangs in Wilmington, North Carolina. And it just moved him. Kind of like when I heard the 80,000 analogy from John Gordon, it just stuck with my heart. He heard this on the news that some 16-year-old kid was killed in a drive-by shooting and gang violence. It just moved him. So he called his friend who was a district attorney and found out there's all kinds of Crips and Bloods gangs in Wilmington. So he asked to meet with the gang leader, a guy named Thug, a real story. And he met with the gang leader of the Crips. And the meeting changed his life. And he realized that gangs are misinterpreted. And I don't want to get into the whole thing. I wrote it in the book, but basically what he learned is that, we hear on TV and we hear in the news the bad side of gangs, the violence, the drugs, the bad part, right? But if you look at the constitution of why gangs were started, they were there to provide brotherhood, because most of these men and women didn't have families. And there's a good side of community and love of the way gangs are supposed to be. And so he learned through Thug about gangs and why people are in gangs do the bad things like drugs and crime. And it's because they're social outcasts and they can't get jobs. And so he starts to think about this. Well, what if I created a company where I hired gang leaders? And so bottom picture to the right, he bought this old warehouse. He raised hundreds of millions of dollars, and he got the backing of Pete Coors and Anheuser-Busch and incredible breweries. And he started a brewery called True Colors Brewery, just opened in Wilmington, North Carolina. And he employs hundreds of people from the brewmaster down, and they're all in the gangs. If you want to work at True Colors, you have to be in a gang. And just an amazing story how he is bringing Bloods and Crips and people that kill each other and hate each other in the street are working side by side. And it's the most incredible story about one man having such a huge influence on the lives of others. Beth, next slide. We talked about this in the Heart-Led Leader, so I won't go into too much, but Frank DeAngelis had a huge influence in my life, and he had a huge influence for thousands of students. Most of you know Frank DeAngelis was the principal of Columbine High School. I wrote about him in the Heart-Led Leader. He was the principal during Columbine during the school shooting 25 years ago, where 12 students and the teacher were killed by 2 gunmen, and most principals would quit. Most principals would have been fired. Most principals would give up. But Frank stayed the course, stayed teaching there, loved those students, stayed committed. And, 20 years later, when he retired, he totally changed the culture of Columbine. He loved these students, gave his heart to these students, had a huge influence on the lives of others. And when I wrote about him in the Heart-Led Leader, I invited 20, 30 former students and teachers to a conference room to talk about Frank, so my ghostwriter and I can write about him. And when they came to the conference room, it was like they all called each other and said, hey, let's all bring a love letter. And they didn't know that which ones were going to be in the room. When all those 20 people came to the room to meet with me and my ghostwriter to talk about Frank for the book, they all brought a letter, a handwritten letter from Frank. They all did. And they showed it to me and my ghostwriter, Nick. And it meant so much to him. This guy, all he did was write letters of encouragement to his teachers, to his administrative staff, to his janitors, to his coaches, to his students. And every day he wrote those letters. And it's become such a lost art. And I'm challenging the people on this call to start writing handwritten notes, start writing letters to each other. It's such a powerful thing. And years later, they'll never throw out that piece of paper. They'll never throw out those letters. Beth, you can move to the next slide. This is Jackson McConnell, and Jackson runs this bank called Pinnacle Bank. And I wrote a beautiful chapter about him and the gift of influence. And it's a great story. A lot of bankers, could be financially minded, strategically minded. Bankers have a banker's personality where they might be not as loose and not as philanthropic and very just driven about growth and, investments. And Jackson is just the opposite of that. Jackson took over a bank that his grandfather started 3 generations ago. And when he came to work for the bank, when he graduated college, it was a little bank, about $200 million of assets. So when he graduated college 20 years ago, he went to work for the bank. His grandfather started the bank called Pinnacle Bank in rural Georgia, and it was about $200 million bank. He worked there for about 10 years. His dad took over, and his dad grew that bank that his grandfather took many years to get to 200 million, grew it from 200 million to 300 million, his father, Jackson's dad. And so when Jackson becomes CEO and chairman of this bank 20 years ago, it was about a $300 million bank when his father retired. Let me give you this punchline. 20 years later, this is a $2 billion bank. It is one of the largest and fastest growing community banks in the country. Jackson McConnell took a $300 million bank that took 50 years to build. And in 20 years, going from 300 million to 2 billion, this guy leads differently. This guy is the real deal. He's come to my leadership retreats. I spent a lot of time coaching he and his staff, and everyone that works for Jackson loves him. I want to just tell you one story about Jackson. And this is the reason why that his bank has grown from 300 million to $2 billion in 20 years. And here's the story. When we interviewed all his employees for the book, they all kind of shared this story. And it was a true story that Jackson was working one day in the office. And if anyone ever been to Elberton, Georgia, it's rural Georgia. Those in Florida right now, how hot it is. I had dinner with my mom last night. We walked outside. I thought I was gonna have a heart attack. It was like 100 degrees last night here in Florida. And humidity was crazy. It was just awful heat. So I understand this heat, and maybe you do too, because you live in Florida. And Jackson McConnell was working one day in his office, and it was so hot, sweltering hot in Georgia. And he looks outside his window, and his office is where one of the banks are. And Pinnacle Bank's headquarters in Elberton isn't some beautiful high rise that's in marble and gold. It's right next to the dollar store, right, and next to a gas station in Elberton, Georgia. But he looks out the window and sees this broken down delivery truck in the parking lot with the hood open, and there's steam coming out, and the delivery driver is trying to fix the truck. And so Jackson gets out of his CEO seat, walks outside in the sweltering hot, and says to the guy, would you like to come inside and cool off in the lobby while you wait for a tow truck or someone to fix the truck? And the guy was thankful, but said, listen, the guy, the tow truck people that fix the car can't be for a couple hours, and I'm in a bind. See, I deliver seafood, and my truck is refrigerated truck that's no longer refrigerated, and I have all the cod, all the squid, all the sea bass, all the fish that's servicing all the restaurants in this area, and it's about to go bad. And so this is what he tells Jackson. And so Jackson says, no problem, I'll get my SUV. And he had this beat up Ford Mercury SUV. And before you know it, Jackson pulls his car around to the truck and opens the back of his car in his coat and tie. And he helps unload all the haddock and seafood and squid and oysters and shrimp and everything out of the back of this truck into his SUV. And the delivery guy got into the driver's seat. And all afternoon, Jackson and his delivery driver went to make all the deliveries, each and every one of those guys' customer. Jackson never told anyone about this. This story happened years ago, but it came out when I was writing about Jackson, the book. And this is the story I chose to write about Jackson, because this is what heart-led leaders do. This is what influential leaders do. This is the true gift of influence. is that he spent his whole day helping, not even a customer, someone that broke down this parking lot. But people want to work for that kind of guy. People want to give their life to that kind of gal. People want to give their business to that kind of person. That is the true gift of influence. Beth, we can move to the next slide. I've told this story before, so I won't go in full, but I finally got to write this whole story in the book of influence. Christian Alfano owns an Italian restaurant in Toronto, Canada. And it's an incredible story written about a book about an owner of a restaurant that had a packed restaurant, and one of the waitresses gets incredible service, gets Tylenol or Motrin for my kid. And anyway, it's an incredible story about how he's built an incredible culture of influence by really teaching his waiters and waitresses the power of making a positive difference. My son and I went into this restaurant. He was 8 years old. Tate's 14 now, so that's 6 years ago. And he was not feeling well, and the waitress, basically tells my son that he probably needs to have some Motrin. And I didn't have any Motrin, so she went across the street to the pharmacy to buy some Motrin, and the Motrin store or the pharmacy across the street was closed. So a busboy got in the car with Christian's leadership and went 10 minutes out of the way to buy my son Motrin while I'm having dinner at this restaurant. And it's an incredible testimony about how when you create a culture of influence. When I interviewed Christian, because he's had incredible results, this little restaurant with 10 seats or 100 seats in the restaurant does, almost $10 million of sales, which is an incredible amount of business for a 100-seat restaurant in the outskirts of Toronto. This one guy trying to build a culture of influence. And if you have to go get Motrin for your customer, if that's what your customer needs, whatever it takes to have an influence on your customers, that's the reason why he has one of the most successful restaurants in Canada. Beth, if you can move to the next slide. This is a great story that I came up halfway through the book. We're doing some research on influence. And when we heard about influence, a lot of words that are kind of light, that are similar to influence that you hear is legacy. You hear that word a lot. What is your legacy? What is your influence legacy? And so every day we meet 2.8 people a day. And that after 365 days, after 78 years, you got 80,000 people. So what is your legacy with those 80,000 people? All the people we lead, all the people we manage, our family, our friends, our whole network of people. What is our legacy? What influence is our legacy? How we influence the lives of others. So I started studying what makes some people have great legacies and what makes people not. And often what I learned was fascinating is that influence doesn't always match up with results. Sometimes you can have astounding results and no legacy. And sometimes you can have mediocre results, but astounding legacy. So here's a perfect example. Vince Lombardi, head coach of the Green Bay Packers in the 1960s. They called him the Pope, often referred to as the greatest coach of all time. Everyone knows Lombardi because the Super Bowl trophy is named after him. It's called the Vince Lombardi Super Bowl trophy, right? I think he won 2 Super Bowls in the 1960s, 5 different NFC national or championships. I mean, he was unstoppable, right? But here's what I learned about Vince Lombardi. When he died in 1970 from a heart attack and died suddenly, they didn't really have a strong successor. And the fact is that he had this incredible run with the Green Bay Packers, but as soon as he died in 1970, the Green Bay Packers tailspin for nearly a decade. They were awful. They didn't win playoffs. They didn't win Super Bowls. And none of his successors, 0 of his successors, went on to coach other college and NFL teams, right? His legacy tree, his influence tree did not bear fruit of future GMs, future presidents of teams, future coaches, future college coaches. And he didn't do that. Right? He has 0 legacy. Here's a guy named Bill Walsh, Move it back to that slide, Beth. That'd be great. Bill Walsh was also a head coach. And Bill Walsh was the head coach of the San Francisco 49ers. He had 105 wins. He's actually ranked 45th of greatest wins. Don Shula had over 350 wins, right? Our coach of the Patriots, right? Has 6 Super Bowls, right? There's so many coaches that have more wins. Bill Walsh is, I think, ranked 45th of greatest wins of all time. He won some Super Bowls, of course, but what makes Bill Walsh, in my opinion, the greatest coach of all time is that he's had over 35 descendants from his influence tree, former assistant coaches, go on to either win a national championship in college or Super Bowl win. So 35 of his descendants went on to become incredible coaches, to win the NFL, to win the Vince Lombardi Trophy, and to win college national championships. His influence tree is incredible. And so that's the challenge, is how do we live a life where we have this influence tree, where the thousands of people that we have an influence on don't just say, oh yeah, he was a great guy, he's a great person, but had a huge influence on me, and then they went on to become great leaders. Our legacy is really our influence tree. And Bill Walsh's legacy is still going on, the people in his tree that are moving on, coaching other great leaders. That's the power of positive influence. Beth, if you can move to the next slide. Nancy Ortberg is an incredible writer. Her and her husband founded a church in California years ago, went on to become one of those mega churches, with 50, 60, 70, 80,000 people, an incredible mega church. And she shared this story with me years ago that just really moved me in a different way. And it taught me a lot about influence. And Nancy was talking about before her and her husband started this incredible, massive, one of the world's largest churches, when they were just starting out in California, building this church, they were going house to house, trying to really, build this mission. And her job was really community impact. And her husband was the pastor. And so she heard that one of local parishioners in her little church was really struggling. And so she went over to this young lady's house, this single mom's house. She drove her car over there. And as soon as she parked, she grabs a kind of a notebook like this and a pen, and she starts taking notes of all the things that the church, all the things that she can do to help this single mom. And she notices right there that the house was getting old. The weeds in the lawn was past her knees. So she wrote, call someone to mow the lawn and get some landscaping. She noticed that the house was a white house, and it was kind of flaky, and the shutters were kind of crooked, and it just definitely needed a great paint job. Someone to paint the house and fix the shutters. She knocks on the door. The doorbell's not working. Writes down fixed doorbell. She gets to the door. This wonderful single mom answers the door, holding 2 different kids, 2 or 3 kids, grabbing her legs. And this lady had her hand filled. As soon as Nancy walks in, the place was messy as can be. That she wrote a note that she needed some housekeeping to clean up the house. And she asked if she could see the refrigerator. And she walked in, opened the refrigerator, no protein, no milk. And so she wrote these notes, opened the cabinets, and need new cupboards and new food. And she had this whole page of notes. And you really told this lady that they want to serve her and help her. And she spent the whole morning really taking an inventory of all the things that the church and her can do to help this single mom. So she gets back to her car. She finishes her notes, all the things that she has to do to help this single mom. And then she closes the notebook. And here's what she says to me. Here's the twist in the story. She said, "You know what I did next?" And I said, "What?" And she said, "I did nothing. I got home. There was some drama in the church and something going on our staff. And some of my kids were sick. And my husband had to go out of town, and this, and life got in the way. And that page of notes of helping that mom never amounted to anything, just got lost in the shuffle." And I love Nancy for being so vulnerable. She actually wrote this story in one of her books. I loved it because what I learned from that is intention. is that we can have the greatest and grandest intentions to make a difference in the lives of others. But if we don't execute, then our intentions are nothing. At the end of the day, the 80,000 people in our stadium aren't going to give us a stand ovation and clap because we changed their life, because we had great intentions, that we had pages and pages of notes of how we want to serve people. It's the true actions every day that we take the time to have actions make a difference in the world. Beth, if you move to the next slide. So here's our challenge this morning. I want us to think about influence. I want us to really spend today going home with your families and talking about that in their life. If they live to 78 years old or older, that they're going to meet 2.8 people a day. And one day we're going to have 80,000 people in our stadium. If you live long and you influence 6 people a day, you're going to have 160,000 people, but you're going to influence thousands of people. And it starts today. And so I like to do an influence audit. And every morning I wake up and say, okay, whose birthday? Who's going through divorce? Whose friend has a kid that's on drugs? Whose friend, what client I have, their son is depressed. We all have our story, right? We just dropped our kid off at boarding school for hockey. He's 14, he's homesick. And Jill and I are having a hard time, a real hard time. I was literally in Rick's office an hour ago, sharing my heart with him. I'm heartbroken, right? We have so many friends stepping up, right? Helping us, praying for us, trying to get us through this tough time. And so I want you to think about your influence audit. Every day, write down a list. Be intentional. Who am I going to call? Who am I going to bless? Who am I going to serve? Who am I going to text? Who am I going to visit? And who am I going to stop to help every day? And be intentional on that. And if we don't do that, we're going to have a great list of all the things we want to do to help people, but never actually really execute. So I wanted to find a chapter in my book to really kind of close up, this influence and what it really means. And years ago, I was at a dinner party with my wife with some other couples, and one of our friends wanted to introduce 4 or 5 couples together. And I got to sit next to this woman named Tina. And Tina was a wonderful lady, an older woman. And I asked Tina what she did and what her profession was. And she said that she was a hospice nurse, that she's been a hospice nurse for over 35 years. And I was fascinated with this because I've never met a hospice nurse. And we've all know what hospice is. That's the nurses that come into your home to allow you to die with dignity and helps you get to heaven or wherever you go when you die. And I was just fascinated. So I started talking to Tina, and so what's it like? For 35 years, you must have helped, thousands of people, get to heaven. And she says, yeah. And the one thing that I've realized that's so sad is a lot of these people are alone. And it's my job as a hospice nurse to make them not feel alone and make them feel that they're loved, before they die. And I just was fascinated. And I said, well, after doing this for 35 years and helping thousands of people, get to heaven, what do they say? What do they say? And she leans over to me and she says, they all say the same thing. I said, you gotta be kidding me. She said, every one of them asked the same 3 questions. I said, you gotta be kidding me. She goes, they all ask these 3 questions, no matter what color skin you are, what religion you are, what background, how old you are. Everyone on my deathbed and my hospice beds, they all ask the same 3 questions. Was I loved? Did I love back? Did I make a contribution? Was I loved? Did I love back? Did I make a contribution? Those are the 3 questions that we're all going to ask on our own hospice deathbed. If we know the questions that we're going to ask, thousands of people have asked that question in front of Miss Tina. How are we going to live our lives differently? Just last week, we dropped off Tate, our 14-year-old son, for hockey school. He's got a gift. He loves hockey. We dropped him off for boarding school. I was fighting back tears, not to cry in front of him, because I knew he was upset. And his wife, my wife, his mom, Jill, was upset. And so I wanted to be strong for her and strong for him. And so I held back the tears and we said goodbye to him. And I knew he'd be homesick. And it's hard to say goodbye to your 14-year-old child. I never thought in a million years my kid would leave home at 14. 18, yes, but 14, no. And I held back all the tears to be strong for him and to be strong for Jill. And Jill and I got in the car last week. We drove up to the Minnesota airport to fly home. We went to a little lunch place because we were starving. And we had a nice lunch, and we talked about how much we were going to miss Tate, and we are kind of emotional, but I didn't want to cry because I wanted to be strong for my wife. We had a glass of wine. I paid the bill and told Jill I'm going to go to the gate. And, Jill, wanted to finish her wine. When I was walking, to the gate, I passed a Caribou Coffee, which is kind of like the Starbucks in Minnesota. And I saw this woman, this young woman, sitting at this coffee table at this airport. And she was bawling. I mean, like crying, sobbing. And she was writing a letter. And I just noted that I've been there before. I'm sure she got her heart broke or something, the death of the family or something. It's heartbreaking. I walked on by. And I went to my gate. When I'm waiting in the gate, I had this feeling that I shouldn't have walked on by, right? That's what the gift of influence is. Most of us walk on by. So I turned around and I walked straight back to that Caribou Coffee. And I didn't even stop and ask her, but I grabbed the chair right at her table and I sat down and I looked right at her and I said, "Rough day?" And she said, "Yeah, I'm from London and my boyfriend is from Minneapolis and we've tried this long distance thing and it's just not going to work. And I'm writing him a goodbye letter." And, she was just holding back the tears. And so I got out of my chair and I went over to her bench side of that thing and sat right next to her and said, "I just dropped my son off 2 hours ago. And I haven't cried yet because I've been holding it in, because I want to be strong for my wife. I want to be strong for my son." And so I told her that. And before you know it, the dams broke and I was crying and she was crying and we were hugging. And I was just, befriending the stranger. And the funny thing is my wife walks by the Caribou Coffee and sees me crying and hugging this woman. And I can just know what my wife's thinking, like, there's my husband crying with a complete stranger in the airport. But my wife knows my heart, right? And knows that I want to be like Mrs. Lynn. And I'm so thankful that I stopped. Never got this lady's phone number or contact information, but she was there for me. I was there for her. And I know that she'll be in my stadium and I'll be in her stadium when I die and she dies. Every day, we're going to have an opportunity to have an influence on the lives of others. And when we have that type of influence, it's random people that we meet. It's people we work with every day. It's every day being very intentional. Who in my life's in pain? In our country, in our culture, we don't handle pain well. And if I think about all the lifelong friendships, the deep influence that I've had in the lives of others, is that I've always wanted to run towards pain. I wrote a whole chapter in a book about running towards pain. Let me dissect this. You might have a friend that's going through a divorce, a friend that's lost a kid, a client that's going through, bankruptcy or something tragic in lives. It happens all the time. And the words that we use to people is total bullshit. Here's what we say. "Oh, Johnny, I'm so sorry for your loss. If there's anything I can do, let me know. Oh, Sarah, I'm so sorry that happened. If there's anything I can do, let me know. Oh, Brian, that's terrible news. I'm so deeply sorry. If there's anything I can do, let me know." If there's anything I can do, let me know are the most bullshit words that you could ever say to anyone. Because here's what that really means. And we've done research on this. Here's what that really means. If there's anything I can do, let me know. Here's what that means. I want you to know that I care, but I don't actually care enough to actually do anything. So I'm going to tell you, if there's anything you need, let me know. Because I know there's a 99.99999% chance you'll never call me up and say, "You know what, I need a friend. You know what, I need you to pick up my kid from school. You know what, I need that." We say it as a cop-out. That's the lives we live. We all do it. If there's anything you need, let me know. I hear that all the time, right? But I never go to people and I never say that. I never say there's anything you need. I walked right up to that lady. I grabbed a chair and sat right down and loved her. I didn't say, is there anything you need? Can I get you coffee? You want a Kleenex? I sat right down and loved her. If someone's going through a tough time, you say, listen, my wife and I want to come over. We got a meal. I know you got a lot going on. What time works for you tonight when I'm dropping over a meal? Oh, no. What time? 7 o'clock? You just are assertive. When people are in pain, you run towards them. I had a dear friend that lost his son with suicide, teenage suicide, an awful situation, cyberbullying. And I wrote about him in the book, my friend Scott. And years after Teddy died, we got talking and he said, of course I had friends. Of course I had family that loved me through this. My son jumped off a bridge and killed himself. It was awful, bullied. I had a lot of people say, if you need anything, let me know. I had very few people to really follow up every day, which I did. Sent them books on grieving and loving him and texting him and calling him and showing up for him. That's the difference of a stadium of 80,000 people clapping, thanking you because you didn't walk on by. You didn't say, if there's anything I can do, let me know. I want us to think about all the people in our lives that we have an opportunity every day to make a positive influence. Because at the end of our life, we're going to ask the same 3 questions. Was I loved? Did I love back? And did I make a contribution? And I hope the people on this Florida Club Managers Association, no matter what role you have, this amazing industry that you're in, that every day that you have an opportunity to meet members and employees, right? And vendors and teammates and every day we have an opportunity to love them, to serve them, to lead them. But most importantly, we have an opportunity to make an influence on their lives. And I hope your stadium is filled with people many years from now, thanking you for the influence that you had on their life. This wraps up our 3-month amazing journey on this Heart-Led Leader journey. Our next webinar is going to be in November, and Beth and I are working on a great new lineup for this next year. We might have a few time for questions if anyone had a question, but I want to just thank everyone for your belief in this program, the Heart-Led webinar series. It's been such an honor bringing 30 different leaders to the Florida Club Managers Association. And I want to be really just raw right now. I love the Florida Club Managers Association. I mean, I got best friends that are managers, right? And I care about these people. And I think we have an opportunity, these 600, 700, 800 clubs in Florida, if we all work together to really be heart-led leaders and to be influencers. I might not be able to change corporate America. It's too big. I might be able to put a little dent in it. I might sell a few million copies to help change the world. But I think I can change the club business right here, starting in Florida. I think we can change 600, 700 leaders that run these clubs and get their clubs to really believe into what this stuff is all about and have this kind of influence on our members. And I'm dedicated to it. And I'm so honored to be a small little part of this cog in the wheel to make an impact with your members and your employees. Thanks so much, and God bless. If you have any questions, you can text them to me and Beth will ask them.
Tommy, while we're waiting on any questions, if anybody has any, the link is in the chat below, and also the password for today is the word influence with a capital I. You have until Friday afternoon to put your credits in for today's session. And as Tommy mentioned, we will be putting next year's program together and getting that information out quickly. And we also have a little surprise coming to everybody here in the next month or so. So thank you for being here today. Tommy, thank you so much for your dedication and your love of our chapter. I hope that our chapter members and all of us have shown you the love back to you that you have given to all of us, and that we continue to do that and be blessed to have each other in our lives. But thank you for today's session. Thank you for all of the sessions we've done. Doesn't look like we've got any questions. Probably people are picking up their tissues and getting ready to go back to their desks for the day. But we do wish everybody a blessed day, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you again, Tommy, and we will speak soon.
Thank you.